Russian troops have launched a shock offensive in Kharkiv and have made their fastest advances in months. I'm Jerome Starkey, this is World at War, and my guest today is General Sir Richard Barrons, one of Britain's foremost military minds and a former Joint Chief. Welcome, General Barrons. Perhaps we could start with Ukraine. What's happening? Kharkiv under attack. Can Ukraine reverse that offensive? Can Ukraine reverse the tide? At the moment, Russia seems to have momentum.
So Ukraine can probably, but not definitely, hold the Russian attack. They're engaged in a just-enough, just-in-time effort, and that depends on the arrival of ammunition from the United States fast enough to get it to the front line to break up the Russian attack.
If you were General Syrskyi, if you were the commander of Ukraine's armed forces at the moment, what would you be doing now to win this war?
So the first thing I would be doing, I would be demanding, not asking, demanding to be able to fire at Russian formations in Russia with the ammunition that has come from the US and Europe. Because unless I can do that, Russian forces can form up at leisure in Russia just 30 miles from places like Kharkiv. And that is an unfair advantage.
Britain's given the impression that they have no objection to their weapons being used against targets in Russia. America has, if I'm right. So America said you can't use our weapons. Britain has said you can use ours. Ukraine has been hitting targets inside Russia already. I mean, so how's that playing out?
So Ukraine makes some of its own weapons like drones, and the UK has supplied good missiles like Storm Shadow, but not very many of them. And the issue here is the use of artillery ammunition, like the HIMARS rocket system that comes from the US, because those are the only weapons that will break up Russian forces as they organise themselves for an offence.
So shooting into Russia with long-range precision rockets like the HIMARS, what else?
So the next thing Ukraine is, it must have more soldiers. It's got to get a move on with mobilising more of its own citizens and training them to fight. Now, that isn't something you can fix in weeks. This is about stabilising the front line in the medium to long term. And then it needs enough weapons and equipment. That can only come from the West, and this year that can only come from the US. But we should recognise the European Union has delivered about half of what it promised. It has to do better, or Ukraine may lose.
Is it just a matter now of resources, of men and materiel, or are there sort of strategic or tactical shifts that might give one side or the other an advantage?
So without weapons and ammunition, there isn't a fight to be had. But then two things really do matter. First of all, Ukraine has to sustain its will to fight, because nobody else is going to send their sons and daughters to fight for them. They've got to find more people. And then they've got to fight well. They need training, not training to stand in a trench with a helmet on and a rifle, but training, if necessary, to go onto the offensive in a big force, perhaps next year, to push the Russians out. Otherwise, this war will stabilise about where it is now.
Next year, 2025?
2025, maybe even 2026. This isn't a war you can fight against the calendar. It's got to be about resources and being ready.
But we saw last summer this much vaunted summer offensive, all this sort of hype and expectation that Ukraine was going to be able to roll back the Russian invaders. They had done that in Kharkiv. They had done that in Kherson. Why were they unable to do that in Zaporizhia?
Well, there was a really big difference last year in that by the summer of last year, Russia had built a formidable set of defences with mines and trenches and artillery and tanks in support. And the Ukraine force was never big enough nor good enough to break through that sort of defence. So that's the challenge.
And how does that change? Simply with more better trained troops?
A lot more firepower, a lot more training, a lot more people for long enough to endure, to break through where they can break through a formidable Russian defence, which is why I say you might get to that point next year, but it may be 2026.
Richard, like throughout this war, there's been these moments where we've focused, or at least Ukraine has really sort of put a lot of concentration on particular weapon systems. So we saw that with long-range rocket artillery, we saw that with tanks. Most recently, and still ongoing, is the demand for F-16s. And yet we also heard from General Zaluzhny, when he was the Commander-in-Chief, that he did not expect what he described as a beautiful breakthrough. I mean, is there any one weapon system or any combination of weapon systems that you think could tip the balance rather?
So it's usually folly to look for some sort of silver bullet, the magic new weapon that changes everything on the battlefield. The fact is that if you're going to fight, you need four things in balance and in strength. You need enough people, you need them equipped, you need them well enough trained, and you need them supported with ammunition, spare parts and medical support. And those things all take time to organise.
F-16s likely to make any significant difference when they arrive?
When the F-16 arrives, it will make a difference because it will give Ukraine Air Force the ability to deter Russian aircraft that are flying over Russian forces but within 40 kilometres of Ukrainian positions and releasing these formidable glide bombs. But it'll only be a part of changing the balance in Ukraine.
And what about Ukraine's campaign that we've seen going? They've been hitting these oil refineries. They have been hitting targets deep inside Russian soil. I mean, this takes us back to where we started. You know, you're saying they need to hit Russian targets inside Russia. They have been doing that to some extent. I mean, the drones have reached the Kremlin. They've hit oil refineries. They've hit train lines and logistics hubs, hundreds, possibly thousands of miles inside Russia. Is that the right? I mean, do you think that's the right strategy to pursue? And do you think it's going to make a difference?
Well, they make a difference, but not really in material or military terms. They shock the Russian people. They make it harder for the Russian government to deny that there is still some sort of minor operation going on in Ukraine. In terms of the actual physical effect, it's quite small. You break a railway and then 24 hours later, the railway will be fixed. So they do have an effect. It's mostly psychological.
But you knock out enough oil refineries, some suggestions 10 to 14% taken out, oil prices go up. I mean, if they keep doing that, could that choke Russia's ability to wage war?
So we need to recognise that Russia is now essentially an energy company that uses the money to buy weapons and ammunition. So if you choke off that supply of energy, they might have less money to buy weapons. But these are still really pinpricks. And one of the more remarkable and I think regrettable aspects of this is when Ukraine has targeted Russian oil infrastructure, there appear to be quiet words coming from the US. Don't do this because you can't put the oil price up in the year of a US election. That's no way to fight a war.
General Sir Richard Barrons, thank you very much. If I understood correctly, the three things that Ukraine needs to do to win: they need to hit targets in Russia, they need more men, better trained troops, and commitment from allies to continue providing enough weapons.
And we've got to do two things. What we're talking about today is giving them enough of all of those things to hold the line. And we need to recognise if we don't do that and Ukraine crumbles, then the war comes to Europe, the thing we've been trying to avoid. And it is madness trying to fight a war for some sort of score draw. You have to go all in and win on your own terms. But we're not yet having the conversation about what Ukraine has to do to get the capability it needs to start to throw the Russians out of their country. And that is a different order of magnitude, roughly 3 times the bill of a successful defence.
General Sir Richard Barrons, thank you for joining me on World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and if you're watching this on YouTube and you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below and we'll do our best to answer them next week.